very good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Adam, Content Marketing Specialist with Schein, and I'll be your moderator. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we will cover as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Please make sure that your volume is up and any large applications are closed on your computer or mobile device to ensure a smooth connection. This webinar is presented by Schein Dental, and no CE credits are being offered for viewing this presentation. I am pleased to welcome Eric Pook as our speaker. Eric is the Manager of Healthcare Leasing with Cirrus Consulting Group. Thanks for being with us, Eric. Over to you.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much. Looking forward to today. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Perfect, great. So we're just experiencing quite a little storm here on the East Coast. So just a little flash of lightning, but really appreciate the second iteration here as we go through to talk about where we're at from a commercial real estate perspective, what dentists are experiencing throughout North America. And really, we've seen an overwhelming amount of requests for help since the last webinar that we did in mid-March. We had more clients reach out for help and retain us than any other month in our 26-year history. So really looking forward to sharing a lot of the feedback we've gotten from the dental community, what we're seeing now from landlords. And in most cases, we're seeing a great and incredible opportunity to be negotiating or renegotiating the office lease. So I really appreciate the introduction and looking forward to a good interactive session. So as mentioned, we have all the Q&As, so please, I know a number of you have sent through a few questions in advance, but please certainly feel free to add some questions as we go, and we'll keep today pretty interactive as we share some details. And I know that there was a question that just came in prior to the webinar where a landlord in April decided to do a sizable rent increase to the doctor, which I hate to say is not uncommon based on what we've seen lately, but certainly something that we want to be proactive about. So a lot of key topics today. The key is about, is now the time to negotiate, renegotiate, to expand or relocate? Because there's a lot of moving parts, and sharing some of the upcoming ADA statistics, it's interesting now that we're seeing ultimately dentistry coming back with a vengeance. We're seeing now from these ADA stats that there's a lot of production is returning back to normal levels. Staff is being paid back in full almost throughout the entire nation. And also, right, many landlords now are still, or some doctors have yet to make their rent payments in full. So really the purpose of today is to go through some real practical tips and tricks, to share some specific recent examples about the importance of the dental office lease, some recent market updates, as well as some key things to be conscious of as we reopen, including if we're making modifications to our space, how important that is. And for those of you on the webinar that own their own location, this is still just as applicable to you. As you may or may not be aware, but the lease is very important when separating the corporation that owns the practice, right, from the corporation that owns the building. So my name is Eric Pook. I'm the Managing Director here at Cirrus Consulting Group. And I wanted to share a couple of key stats. Now, this was similar to last time, but very relevant based on even the hundreds of leases we've received from doctors throughout the nation since the last webinar. So 85 still holds true to today. 85% of dentists, including the hundreds that are on the webinar today, 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. That boils down to the assignment sections in the lease, as well as the amount of control the landlord has upon choosing whom and when they can authorize the assignment of that lease to. In addition to that, right now, 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. So a key takeaway from today is if you haven't had a recent market update, or if you're not sure about what current market prices are, especially amongst COVID, with the impacts now with certainly rental rates, vacancies, or otherwise, there will be a section in survey to request an updated building report and rental rate analysis to ensure that in fact you're paying fair and equitable rents, because what we're seeing now throughout the nation are landlords are anxious to do deals. And if you've looked recently, there's a lot of for lease signs up there. And those landlords, many of which are especially mom and pops that are heavily leveraged, it's a very difficult time to be a landlord right now. So some of the core strategies that we're seeing is that for doctors looking to expand or relocate or otherwise, landlords in many cases are desperate to fill those vacant spaces, which creates an incredible time to be structuring the lease accordingly and helping to reset financials. And last but not least, this, which is always a big takeaway, is that 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them the right of at least 50% of the proceeds when the practice is sold. And talking to one of the top, Mike Appalucci, who's one of the top PPT reps for Henry Schein out on the East Coast, he continued to say that the number one reason why a practice sale deal dies in his market, which is New York, New Jersey, is because of the lease. So we're going to touch on some of the strategies today. But first, who are we? Cirrus Consulting Group, pretty unique. We were founded by dentists, for dentists, now 26 years ago, back in 1994. We are very unique. We are the only healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. What gives us some unique prowess is we're typically the company that gets called when the surprises or the things hit the fan. So we've done over 12,000 successful leases negotiated. We have an in-house attorney, leasing, consulting departments. We represent hundreds of doctors throughout North America each year. I do deliver a lot of continuing education courses, as well as obviously lecturing. And it seems like yesterday I was at the Greater New York in the Schein booth. And then of course it became a triage center just a few weeks later. So hopefully where you are, you're safe and families are safe, and certainly doing our best through these very unusual times. And a big takeaway from today is you're not alone. This is an incredibly confusing, frustrating, unprecedented time, of which the likes that we've never seen before. Yes, we had 2008 and other terrible events back in 2001, but you're not alone. And what's important through this is to get as much information as you can. Information is power, right? Ensure that you're aware of what's included within your lease, to really ensure that you're aware of what your rights and responsibilities are as a tenant, and to be smart and to look to see a bit of the glass being half full, as in our experience and all the deals we're currently negotiating now, is that the landlords are very anxious through the letter of intents and really looking to help structure an agreement. And we haven't seen it being that tenant friendly really since 2008. So let's dig right in, shall we? And again, please, the Q&A section, feel free to add some questions as we go, and happy to go through some questions. This is being recorded, so for those of you on the line or those of you driving home or in the Northeast with the massive hurricane coming through, definitely safety first, and you will receive a recorded version of this as well. All right, so COVID-19 and your dental office lease is now the time to negotiate, renegotiate, expand, or relocate. So how are we going to break this down? So we're going to go through some key market trends. We're going to look through updates as of today, as well as the recent ADA weekly updates as released from the survey results last week. We're also going to touch on some solutions to some of the most common challenges and lease-related concerns that we have today, and a lot of things that doctors are missing as they're reopening, as they're making changes, and how important it is that the lease and the landlord are in the loop. We're also going to touch on a couple of the basics in terms of why the lease is so important through COVID-19. Also, we'll go through a little bit of time in terms of, when is the right time, and why might it be the right time for you and your practice to look at potentially expanding, or look at things no different as the Rockefellers did through the Great Depression, to look at expanding and growing. There is a large amount of doctors now looking to exit or transition in the next few years, right? The long view of dental, of course, is incredibly strong. We've seen a lot of super cycles for many practices. My own personal dentist is booked out until October for a weekend appointment, September for a weekday appointment. So there's a lot of pent up demand, and I'm a little reluctant that I delayed my last hygiene appointment. And then, of course, we're going to touch on specifically some of the clauses. What are some of the key things in terms of how to structure in your lease post-COVID-19? A lot of questions about, is there COVID-19 language or pandemic language, et cetera, right? And then, of course, how do we do it, right? When Eric, do I reach out to the landlord? How do I engage with the renewal conversation? My lease is coming up in 2 years. When is the right time to start the process? And we'll touch on all of that today. So again, making sure that at the end, we've got some good, really good tactical best practices, tips and tricks, as well as a great opportunity to get some updated market reports or a lease review for those of you, again, an appreciation for your time today. So let's jump in to the market trends. So here's what we're seeing now nationally. And again, we're involved with clients from Honolulu to Anchorage, right, all the way through San Diego, Seattle, throughout the Northeast, down through South Florida right now, where we've seen a big scurry of activity, and everything in between. So based on the current ADA stats, if you didn't see it come through last week, 44.8% responded to the survey being open and business as usual. 51% were open, but lower patient volume, right? Which basically shows us now we're all back up and running for the most part, with the exception of a few, and most are back to normal. Some obviously with an increasing amount of patient flow. There's the link below for source results. Interestingly though, that also over half responded that they're either 76% or greater of normal collections year over year, many of which had a very strong June and especially into July. And now looking at, again, being booked out, getting back to normal levels of production. And interestingly also, about 92% are paying their staff fully, right? Since we've been open with the PPP loans, et cetera, which were obviously very well received and very helpful for making the rent payments. In terms of rent payments, there are a number on this webinar, and I'm sure others, that have yet to make all previous rent payments. So if I can quickly pause there, if any of you have not made all your rent payments in full or have not received a specific lease amending agreement that does clarify how any rent deferrals or rent abatements were to be structured. If you don't have something and it was just the property manager that said, hey, yeah, don't worry, Dr. Smith, pay me what you can, then that is something that you do want to take some urgency on, because we have seen a number of doctors forward us their default letters from their landlord because of the fact that they're now 2, 3, 4, 5 months behind, or there's been some sort of a proposal or an email proposal that wasn't yet captured into an agreement. So for those of you that are behind or have not made a specific agreement and properly documented it, that is something that certainly should be discussed and planned upon, because the risk of default, of course, it's not the landlord that's in trouble, it's because of COVID, is that you as a tenant may have missed some of your obligations. We always suggest, of course, making sure that you meet your contractual obligations, but if in fact you haven't and you're a little behind, then that does give leverage. And that does give leverage to help to renegotiate and come up with a plan to the landlord to get you off their red list, if you will. Vacancies now, of course, are going up. A lot of the bubble teas or sandwich shops or nail salons or otherwise, as you've noticed probably in your own malls, are changing hands or going out of business or walking away. So vacancies are high. That means landlords have an increased pressure to meet their own mortgage obligations, and many of which are unfortunately, many landlords may end up losing or have the banks call their loans. Also, right, in terms of month-over-month changes, we've seen a lot of variance throughout most aspects of the country in terms of specific changes for vacancies and rental rates. And of course, sales volumes, for the most part, have been down as well in terms of lease rates. Deferrals and abatements we touched on. Many of which received a 1, 2, or 3 months worth of deferrals. There was also some good success we had with clients. We were able to move a month or 2 months to the end of the term, which was a great strategy. Other good strategies that worked were to use the security deposit in lieu of April or May's rent, which was again helping to free up cash flow, or to structure a nice deferral that move things forward, or also a number of good successful results where in exchange of an upcoming renewal or renewing the lease early, we were able to negotiate a month of free rent in exchange for each year of rent deferral, or for a renewed lease term. So a lot of different strategies have worked well. Unfortunately, we've seen the opposite. We've seen some landlords, as one of the attendees today has posted here, that unfortunately, ran into the scenario where the landlord decided to not only not help him through April, but also decided to raise his rent considerably through the month of April. In other cases, those that said, oh, I've got a great relationship with my landlord, he's fantastic. Well, the second we needed him when we closed up in March and April, they wouldn't even pick up the phone. So I think now amongst the dental community, they're seeing now that, the lease is very important, and especially with COVID, it's critical now that we have a strategy in terms of making sure that before a second wave or otherwise, let's make sure we have the best possible agreement in place. And then of course, for renewals and new starts, there is an unprecedented opportunity now, in my opinion, to be engaging with landlords, to be renegotiating leases, to help leverage the uncertainty of COVID, that landlords are very anxious to be securing deals and long-term deals. And what's also interesting is an appreciation for the dental tenant. Look, you are the best tenants on the planet. You pay, right, some of the most in rent. You have sizable, right, practices. You also have some of the lowest default rates of any other tenant, right, about 0.5% or less. Also, you have some of the highest build-out costs of any other tenant. So therefore, it gives you some of the most amount of leverage to negotiate a proper lease. And also, when you sell your practice, right, typically for any retail or other type of client, it's for some of the highest value. And of course, the lease, as you know, the agreement of the purchase and sale is typically always required to be transferred from finances, or also transferring based on the successful assignment of the lease. So let's jump into some of those today. Lots of good questions as we come through. We're going to handle some of those. What happens if a doctor passes away due to COVID-19? Will it void the lease? Well, unfortunately, the short answer is no. And in many cases, that will be impacting your successors or heirs. So for those of you that are concerned about the impact of COVID and your health, certainly very well justified, but depending on the components within your lease, the proper strategy here and solutions to some of those challenges like the death and disability is to put in something called a death and disability provision, which is that in essence, if in the event, heaven forbid, you pass away due to COVID-19 or become disabled or chronic lung disease or inability to practice wet figure dentistry, please, doctors, for those making notes, please ensure that in your next lease renewal or in your next lease agreement, if you're expanding, right, a properly worded death and disability clause is imperative to give you that additional protection that gives you, in essence, a termination right. So again, heaven forbid, if you were to pass away due to COVID-19, there should be a section in the lease that would allow you the opportunity, or your estate, to give a 60 or 90 days notice to relieve you of that obligation. If not, we had a terrible situation of a doctor north of the office, was 43 years of age, and unfortunately passed away 3 weeks prior to the grand opening of his practice. And of course, you've got a fully built out practice, no doctor, no patients. What's that practice worth? Unfortunately, in this case, zero, and in many cases less than zero, because the landlord held the estate and the spouse to not only the almost $10,000 a month in rent payments, but also that increasing at 4% per year for the next 9.5 years. So again, based on solutions to some of these, very important that, again, each and every one of you have a properly structured death and disability clause. That if you're unable to practice dentistry, right, or you were to pass away, your estate should have the ability to not be held in default and to be able to assign the lease and sell your practice, or at least to be absolved of the continuing liability post-sale. So again, if you have any questions on these, please email us a copy of your lease. Our team's standing by at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. We're happy to go through some of those if you have any specific questions or if you're following along. A couple other components here is alterations. So ask yourself, did I make any significant changes to the space? Did you cordon off any of your operatories? If so, and you impacted the airflow, did you get the landlord's written approval? Did you change your flooring, for example? Did you make any alterations to the space, even minor cosmetic? If so, check your lease, look to the alterations section. In most cases, even the most basic of changes needs landlord approval. And if you've also even put up some plastic sheets to separate some of the operatories, that might impact the airflow and then also might be a fire code violation, which again, the landlord needs to be aware of. So if you have not made the landlord aware of some of the changes, that could impact and create a default situation if you've made an unapproved change. So be cautious with any partitions, walls, HVAC changes, etc. Again, the landlord is the lord of the land, which makes all the rules, and we certainly want to be conscious of that. So that is one mistaken solution there. We touched on the rent shortfall and coming up with a specific solution and making sure that that's properly documented with a lease amending agreement. Also with default, if there has been a default issue, that could be late charges, or we've seen accelerated rent, some landlords charging the tenant 3 months to the doctor just for being late, or asking for an increased security deposit, or in some cases termination rights, that the landlord can terminate the lease if the doctor's more than a certain period of time behind. The other thing to notice in the lease is there any notice or cure period? Do you have, if you are in default, does the landlord have to tell you? Which you may be in default and not even know it. And we had a doctor that had reached out. When they tried to renew their lease years later, right, the landlord had found that they were in material default years prior on the hours of operation. So purely because the landlord required the practice be open 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and the doctor was closed on Wednesdays and open every second Saturdays, the landlord used that, right, unbelievably, as reason to force that doctor to not be able to renew her lease, and she was forced to relocate. And it cost her almost $300,000 to move down the road. So these are just some of the key things you want to be aware of and the impact to the specific lease. Hours of operation we touched on as well, regulatory requirements, again, let it be air filtration, HVAC, etc. Look to your specific dental association, obviously, for some of those requirements, but ensure that, again, the landlord is in the loop if you are making any of those changes. And one of the biggest takeaways is, of course, with the month-to-month lease, which is, for some may think, okay, well, hey, that relieves me some liability if I choose to walk away, or if I sell, that maybe puts me in a better situation. So if you are in a month-to-month lease, I can't stress enough the importance of having the lease reviewed and to create a strategy, because it is exposing you now to potentially prevent you from selling the practice. What's stopping the buyer to go directly to the landlord, right? What are they buying? If it's not for the continuity and predictability of the revenue for your practice, if you're in a month-to-month lease, the landlord could put a brown envelope on your door tomorrow and say, here's your 30 days notice and you're out. So while you might think that might be unlikely, right, even if there's a slight risk, right, it's important, because I can tell you there's group practices and there's doctors looking at the glass half full that are looking to move into your beautiful units or end caps or lots of natural light. So it's important to be, again, aware, clear, and be very clear on the term of your lease as well. And one of the last big pieces here in terms of some solutions are missed opportunity to negotiate, which is especially for those, if their lease is expiring in the next 2 or 2.5 years, that is, in our experience, some of the best time to be engaging in renegotiations with the landlord. Why? Because it can be upwards of 18 months to relocate a practice. The landlords know that. So they're going to wait until the option to renew deadline date, right, which is typically 6 or 9 or 12 months prior. If you don't submit written notice of your desire to exercise your option, that means it becomes null and void, and you lose your ability to stay in that practice. after your lease expires. So you might think, hey, you know what, Eric, I've got another, 2 5-year options. But I'll tell you, probably at least 20 to 25% of the doctors I've talked to had missed their option to renew deadline and are now into the situation where they have no right to stay in the space after the lease expires in early 2021. So again, we want as much continuity and predictability. And again, your neighbors and the other tenants, they're renegotiating. So don't miss this opportunity to be focused on it. Another big one now is personal guarantees, where many of you might have recently realized that through your lease agreements, you've signed it personally. And I won't ask for a show of hands or ask for that in the Q&A component. But if you do see your name personally and not your corporation, or if you're listed as a personal guarantor or indemnifier, that does mean that if in the event that through COVID-19 or otherwise you were forced to close your doors, that does give the landlord complete access to come after you and any personal assets. So as part of the renewal strategy and the negotiation strategy, very important to focus that as a top priority. And for some of you, in the assignment section of the lease, when you go to sell your practice, you may also realize that there's a continuing liability section, meaning that even after you sell, you are still bound and as a personal guarantor. So if, Dr. Brown, who buys your practice from you, if they default on the lease, then that comes back after you, and in many cases can come back after you first and skip going after the new tenant. So these are, again, just some key solutions as we go through. Goes without saying, the lease is important. And I think with COVID, it's shown us now that all the things we thought would never happen to us in our lifetime, they can happen. So the lease now becomes a critical component. And after, the staff, we've laid off our staff, etc., right? The number one expense became rent. So we saw an unprecedented, over hundreds of doctors that had sentenced their lease and hired us to help to deal with this unique situation, which was the fact where the location is the absolute foundation of the practice. The practice is your location, and the doctors are the new anchor tenants. Doctors today can never work from home, right? The major landlords and otherwise are realizing that their accountants are leaving, right? Lawyers are leaving, professional services are leaving because they can work from home. Google's not opening up till 2021. So throughout this process, I think that there's a greater appreciation from the landlord community that the dentists can never work from home. And they're some of the best tenants on the planet. In addition to that, again, failure to pay could be catastrophic, especially if we're behind or if we don't have that as a specific agreement. And the build-out costs, right? If we were to relocate or build out a new practice, that can easily be $200 to $250 per square foot, depending on your location and the finishings. But also, we've seen some landlords now in some of the recent successful negotiations we've done, the landlord is covering the entire build-out costs for the new doctor. They were that anxious to secure the doctor. And we had one that was 73 years of age, tried to sell her practice 3 separate times. In each and every case, the landlord said no. One to an associate, one to her business partner, and one to a corporation. And unfortunately, each time the landlord said no. So doctor hired us. We relocated her practice about 10 minutes north. This was in Northern California. And as a result, she wrote us an amazing Google review. She said it was the best money she's ever spent on her practice because how important it is to have a lease that is able to be successfully transferred when you choose to retire. Of course, very difficult and expensive and time consuming to move. And of course, the practice sale. And of course, it gives you leverage, right? The longer the term of the lease, the more predictability and continuity you have for the incoming buyer. So fantastic. I see a bunch more Q&As have come through. Thank you very much. We're going to do a Q&A section towards the end, so please keep those questions coming, and then we'll go through that individually. Perfect. So again, if we could wave the magic wand, what should we have it do for us post-COVID-19? So a couple of components. Number one is it should be fair and affordable financial terms. And from those of you that recently joined, you need to have the facts. So find out what current rental rates are for your building, vacancies, in your area, in your submarket, etc. Again, for those of you that are on this webinar, we'll do that as a complimentary review. Details will follow afterwards, but we'll do a market rate analysis for you. So at least you know, right? Am I paying fair rent or not? And especially if we're looking at a long-term lease for a 5 or a 10-year term with 2 5-year options, that gives you leverage. Think about it from the landlord's perspective. They've got a bunch of defaults. They've got a bunch of tenants that are trying to walk away or break the lease. They've got a bunch of vacancies. And think about you as a successful dental practice that's coming back and saying, you know, not only I'm not looking for anything free, but I'm looking to propose, right? COVID-19 has caused me to reevaluate my growth goals and my, you know, long-term career goals. And one of the main aspects of the contracts that we want to revisit is the lease. So we'd like to submit a proposal looking at a new 5 or a 10-year term with 2 5-year options. And we want to make sure it's aligned to the current economic climate and where we look forward from here. So that's definitely where we're seeing some key focus and success now, because landlords can start to recognize some of that revenue now with a long-term lease. So again, think about it from the landlord's perspective and how valuable you are to them. Risk and exposure, we mentioned before, including as flexibility. So let that be personal guarantees, continuing liability, or of course to maximize the flexibility, including a death and disability clause, or if you're negotiating a new lease, there should be some termination rights that if in the event the landlord is unable to provide you with the certain information at a certain period of time or deliver you the space within a certain period of time, they should be improving on that as well, and through the death and disability clause. And last but not least, obviously through the assignment section to help ensure that it's very clear as to whom you can sell to, and it minimizes the landlord's ability to, you know, add conditions or withhold consent or delay consent upon the eventual sale. Okay, so now to the big question that we've had lots of calls and questions on. Should we expand or to relocate right now? Well, the first piece is, for those of you with the lease in front of you, let's get the calculators out and let's look at some key performance indicators. First off, let's try to figure out what our production is going to be for 2020. I know that that's a loaded question, but let's look back to 2019. Let's do some extrapolations and let's figure out the best case, worst case, and objective for production. And let's look at that production per chair. Typically, if we see a production of about, you know, $250 per chair, usually means that you're running a very efficient practice as a single practitioner, or perhaps with some associates. And that might be a good trigger point to look to potentially expand to the space next door. Many of you might have had a barber shop or, you know, another tenant that's become vacant and said, well, hey, you know what, I could really use another 2 operatories. I sure do want to take advantage of this now. And we were involved with a project where the doctor actually moved paid some of the moving expenses to move the dry cleaner next door. And it was a fantastic option for the doctor because they needed the space and it made great financial sense. And the costs were minimal to move the dry cleaner to a different spot in the mall. The other one is tenancy expense as it relates to production. So now you want to look at how much are you spending to the landlord over the course of the year, both as a base rent as well as additional rents, divided by the total, right, revenue, the total collections that you've been receiving over the course of the year. That should be about 8.2% as we look at nationally. Now, for those of you that are running the numbers now and looking at it, and are into the 15, or we had one recently that was 22%. Well, look, it's a hard conversation to say, look, my production is not equal to how much I'm paying in rent, and it's killing me how much we're paying in rent. To either use that as leverage with the landlord to negotiate a better deal, or let's keep the landlord honest and let's negotiate a proposal with a vacant space across the road and see how anxious they are to relocate your business. That might be perhaps a little less foot traffic, or it might not be in a prominent mall or otherwise, but At this point, if your tenancy expense is that far off, it's time to have a hard look at the numbers and to determine strategy upon that. And if you're sick and tired of paying the high rent and you feel like you're paying over market, or right, based on COVID or otherwise, you just don't see yourself in that location, then if there's ever been a time to dip your toe in the water to look at what other landlords might be doing to bring over an established, successful, profitable dentist, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised and pleased based on, based on specifically what you bring to the table. And in many cases, that'd be through tenant improvement allowance or other incentives, there is a significant amount of value there that you bring. And if nothing else, that can also be used as leverage to keep your current landlord honest, right? And use that as the opportunity to say, look, I don't want to move, but due to COVID-19 and lack of production and my transition plans, I do need to have a lease that's aligned with that. All right, so current lease obligations, again, is a key component. In your lease, do you have a surrender or restoration requirement in the lease? So what I mean by that is in your lease, there can be a requirement that can require you to either remove either all or some of the leasehold improvements that you've made in the space, or in some cases, all the way back to the original lease. If you bought the practice from someone else, you may be required to return it to pre-dental condition or gray shell or vanilla shell condition on the way out. So that comes as a big surprise to many doctors to know that they can't just walk away or throw their keys, into the lake and walk away. The landlord may have put language in there that might not make it that easy. And if the landlord can avoid paying $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 worth of demolition fees, and they can have you do it because another tenant wants to take over that space and doesn't want it as a dental practice, then definitely that becomes your obligation. So be cautious about what's in the lease today. And then last but not least, again, the landlord's perspective, they are in a weakened state. Now, not all, but even some of the large institutional landlords, we've seen a very unique and marked change where, especially throughout the continental US, there is a heightened urgency to be securing long-term leases, to give them and their financials as much predictability as well. So there's been a very large anxiousness to do deals, especially for new doctors looking to move into a vacant space or to expand. So again, some positive feedback for you this afternoon. I know there's lots of good questions, so we'll finish some of these components here quickly and jump into some. Again, for those of you that have recently joined, there's a little Q&A section. Please feel free to add those and we'll move that forward. So the next big question we have is, how do I structure my lease post-COVID-19? And on the next screen here is some key components to be aware of, look out for, and to be clear on how it's going to be structured for you. So the first big question is, Eric, can I put in blanket pandemic language that gives me a, get out of jail free card or get out of my lease free card if in the event we have a second wave? Well, the short answer is no. Right? The landlords just aren't going to agree to a blanket exit and termination, right? Very, very, very unlikely. Again, we've got to think about what's in it for them. However, as I mentioned, with new deals or with expansions or otherwise, if the landlord is unable to deliver certain things by a certain period of time, then of course, that does give us more rights to terminations and otherwise. Alterations, we mentioned before. If you have made any specific, even some basic cosmetic changes, have a look through your lease for the alteration section and to determine, hopefully it does say that, for any changes under 5,000 or non-structural changes under 10,000, etc., the doctor has the ability to do. If not, then we need to figure out a smart plan and perhaps include that into the renewal negotiations on how to ensure that we're not going to be held in default or be, because we've made unapproved alterations or changes. Fixturing period, again, that's the time from getting the keys from possession all the way through to commencement of the lease. So for those of you negotiating a new deal, that should be an ample amount of time, in some cases up to half a year, as you're building out to avoid having to pay base rent. Some other key components: termination or continuous operation language. So a lot of doctors were surprised, and many received a default notice in March that stated that, one in a strip mall, that said, doctor, per the continuous operations clause in your lease, you are required to be open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, notwithstanding COVID-19. However, you are required to be open, and therefore we're finding you in material default of your lease, and here's all the terrible things that are going to happen next, just for being closed, right? Even though it was in obviously a state of emergency. So these are the type of things that some landlords are doing to make life very difficult for the dental community. And please, it's not just dentists, but obviously they know that the dental community is most likely to be able to continue to pay rent. And if they need to increase, the landlord needs to increase their revenue, well, obviously they know the dental tenant, unlike the restaurants and the bars and the clubs and the other businesses that may not be in as solid of a financial state. The assignment clause we've discussed specifically. The other here is demolition. So the demolition is important because in major urban centers, not uncommon that the landlord, even in exchange for some free months, may want to slip in a demolition right or a personal guarantee. The demolition right, though, basically gives the landlord carte blanche, that 30 days or 60 days or 90 days or 6 months notice to the tenant for any reason that they intend to demolish the building, and you're out. So that, of course, can be a major issue for someone looking to buy a practice or buy your practice. And as the bank goes through the due diligence and they see that, right, the new buyer might only have a guarantee of 6 months to be there, is definitely going to impact some of the credit and other decisions. So very important that you have a very tenant-friendly demolition, or ideally remove that. Relocation rights. A lot of the doctors and leases that I reviewed personally, or my team, saw that there was a relocation right. And that is arguably, in some cases, just as bad as a demolition right, where the landlord within 30 or 60 days notice can serve you notice that they are moving you from suite 101 to suite 3B in the basement. And unfortunately, it's all predicated on what's in the lease. And for one lease I reviewed last week, very unfortunately, the landlord would cover all of the relocation expense up to a maximum of 2-month payments of $6,000, or covering all of the expenses to a maximum of $12,000. I can hear the chuckles from here. Of course, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands to build out a practice and move it down the road, so, or to a different unit in the building. So please note the relocation language in the lease. Death and disability, I'll circle back to that again in some of the questions. Surrender, right? It might not be just that easy to walk away. The other component is overholding. Look through your lease and look through the overholding section. Feel free to take a screenshot of this. In many cases, your lease, if you are in a month-to-month situation, the landlord has the right to increase your lease rate by 150, or in some cases 200% of your base rent, just for being month to month. And depending on your lease, they could go back to the month that you became a month-to-month tenant and back bill you. So again, COVID-19, these are completely unusual times, and very, very important that you're aware of what's in the lease, and you're not putting yourself or your practice into any unneeded harm's way. Personal guarantee, chargebacks, quiet enjoyment, subordination non-disturbance agreement, another great one. If you're reading through your lease as we go, if the landlord goes bankrupt, what happens to your lease? Depends is the short answer. Unfortunately, that's the theme for tonight, because every single lease is unique. Every one we've received, everyone's different. There should be a subordination non-disturbance agreement that gives you the ability to have the lease be subordinate to the mortgage, which means that if the landlord goes bankrupt, right, then the bank takes over, your lease, right, is protected. So that again is key. If you're in default, does that impact your exclusivity? Are you allowed to be the only dentist in town or in your mall? And if you don't have exclusivity, what impact would that have if a DSO moved in next door, right? Because they've been just, looking at that tenant next door or that one around the corner that they'd love to move into. So exclusivity, to be the only dentist or the only specialist in your building, can be another great way to help protect your future production for both you as well as your future buyer. And one last point is the financial statements. So what a lot of, unfortunately, and crafty, the landlord said for any of the dentists that said, hey, I need some help, can you defer my rent payments? What a lot of landlords did throughout the country is came back and said, great, send me your financials. And of course, most doctors said, whoa, I don't want you to send you my personal and corporate financials, and they went away. So the landlord instantly had the opportunity to take from 1,000 of these rent deferrals and requests down to half or less. It was a great strategy that unfortunately, caused many dentists not to be able to get some advantages of some rent deferrals or other improvements. But also be cautious. If the landlord did ask for your financials, and in their lease, in your lease, it has the ability to request it at any given time. For some of you, in that financial sections, you would have a responsibility to send them whatever they've asked for within 15 days, including your personal financials. And if you did not, that also may hold you in default. So be cautious of that, and please be very clear on your obligations, especially if the landlord's requested something like your financials in writing. This, in the essence of time, we won't go through in too much detail, but this is just a prime example of the assignment section found in 75% of dental leases throughout the country. And I just highlighted a couple of the red flags here. So number one is we cannot sell the practice without first the written consent of the landlord. And then number two here on the third line down, it states here that even after you've asked, so you've got a practice broker, you've sold the practice, and then as an end result, you ask the landlord to transfer. The landlord has three options. One, they can approve. Number two is they can decline. Or look at number three, 4 lines down, they can terminate the lease agreement as of the effective close date on the lease. So let me pause there. Just in exchange, or just for asking the landlord to sell your practice and transfer the lease, the landlord can terminate the lease, effective the date of sale. So ask yourself, what impact would that have to the buyer or to the sale if you no longer have the ability or the right to stay in the practice? And if that scares away your buyer, now you've got to be out by that close date and you don't have a buyer to transfer to. So these are just some of the sections here. Again, this is another section that upon the transfer of the lease, the landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be either the current market rate or the greater of 15% greater of the market rent today. So, and this happens quite frequently. Landlords want to use this as an opportunity to make money. And as an end result, unfortunately, the landlords use it to raise rent upon sale, and that scares away the buyers. Also down towards the below, there's the consideration language that can give the landlord right to a percentage of your practice sale proceeds. So again, just one section of the lease, the assignment and subletting section, right, which any one of these individual sections could be impacting hundreds of thousands of dollars to you and your practice or to the eventual sale. So let's get into the strategies, what's working, what we're seeing now. First off is look to see when your lease expires. Put that into your calendar, right? Put that into not only when your lease expires, but also when is your option to renew deadline? When do you have to give them notice to exercise your option? And in our experience, it's best to complete the negotiations prior to that day. Because if you just exercise your option, it means you agree to everything within the lease with the exception of rent. So When does your lease expire? If it expires in the next 2 to 2.5 years, perfect time to be reviewing the lease and thinking about strategy. Also, some tenant improvement allowance is another aspect that many new landlords are looking to do to entice doctors to move to their space. Rent relief and deferral we touched on. Additional rent, being able to help to give some relief or renegotiate some of the additional rents, because now goodness knows how many thousands of dollars we've paid for common area maintenance and otherwise, and we've been closed. So in the renewal, make sure, focus on what you're responsible for and what you're not. Should you have to pay for the landlord's broker commissions to bring in a new tenant, right? Should we have to pay for the landlord's legal fees or otherwise? So it's important to know what is in it, and that again, your lease is structured accordingly. And ultimately what to do is take some action, right? Don't look back in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months and say, you know what, geez, when we were right in the heart of COVID, what could I have obtained in terms of, let it be new financials or otherwise, or what changes could I got through while the landlords are in this, distracted and unique state. Ultimately though, first step is just, again, read the lease. I can't tell you how many doctors I spoke to have never read their lease until now. And if you haven't had it professionally reviewed before, again, as appreciation for all those on the line, there'll be the ability to either email us directly or click on the survey results at the end to say that you'd like to schedule a call, and we're happy to schedule a quick consult with either myself personally or one of our senior consultants. Just to close on a couple of points here is again, it really is, in my opinion, an unprecedented opportunity for a few reasons. Number one is landlords, by and large, are very anxious to be securing long-term leases and long-term renewals. It also gives the opportunity to be resetting the financials and the markets to market rates. And of course, those thinking about expanding, or little Rockefeller gene into you, looking to expand and grow and make strategic investments through these uncertain times. Financing rates, we know the Fed, right, has come out and said they're not even thinking about raising rates. So they're the lowest in our lifetime, right? That gives a unique opportunity for existing doctors, right, looking to move into a space. Some banks are obviously still in a cautious situation, but still accepting applications. Great opportunity for equipment and supplies. And of course, landlords are, as mentioned, very anxious to be filling some of those vacancies. So the when is key. So right now, 24 months prior to expiring is one of the best times to be starting to re-engage the landlord to talk about a proposal to look at renegotiating the lease. Now, why do I say 24 months? Well, it can be upwards of 18 plus months to relocate a practice. And this example came from a landlord seminar where their goal is to wait and defer and delay as much as possible. You might try to reach out and you keep getting shut down. That's part of the landlord's playbook. They will wait and delay 12 months to 8 months, or in some cases, even after your option to renew deadline has expired. And now they have complete control. So use the information as power, and make sure that you are being proactive in this negotiation, and don't leave it all to the last minute. Just to close here, we have the, who is your real estate intelligence partner? We have 95 billion square feet through our proprietary software that we utilize, both in-house as well as some of the commercial real estate data we have. So if you've had any curiosities about base rent, vacancies, etc., again, please click yes for that rent rate analysis lease review, and we'll schedule that and pull that for you. Again, complimentary and appreciation for your time. So again, to the how. So over 26 years, here's what we found out first: what to do and what not to do. So number one is get all the information. If you don't have a digital signed copy of your lease, it's not worth the paper it's written on. I implore you to email the landlord now and say, please, per, it can be part of PPP or otherwise, and just digitizing your office, but just ask them for a digital copy of your lease, as well as any amendments, riders, or exhibits, to get to know exactly what your signed contractual obligations are. That's number one. Number two is then spend the time to figure out your practice and career goals. Number three is to then review or have your office lease reviewed for risks. and analysis. Number 4 is get the facts, figure out what vacancies rates are, rental rates, what comps are for the area. That's number 4. And then number 5, think ahead. What's the carefully choreographed game of chess to help accomplish to get as many wins as possible? Let it be reducing or limiting some of the personal guarantees and liability, or in addition, perhaps it's to ensure that post-sale, right, we're absolved and we're not held continually liable. Could also be reduce the requirements to return to pre-dental condition at the end of the lease if we were to walk away. Can be term, financials, etc. Figure out that whole plan. Now, what have we not done yet? At this point, we have yet to pick up the phone and call the landlord. Yet, unfortunately, as many on the last webinar attested afterwards, the first thing they did last time was, oh, hey, I better renew my lease. Let's pick up the phone and call the landlord. Don't do that, because you want to, again, go in with a carefully choreographed strategy. And don't forget, the landlord, all they do all day, every day, is negotiate rent and leases. They're not, right, doing clinical care. They're not doing hygiene. They're not doing, perio consults. They are purely negotiating leases. So do yourself that favor. Then negotiate the financial components. Then negotiate the business clauses of the lease. And then, right, make sure that you get a countersigned copy executed by the landlord. That is definitely some of the key ways to help win through those negotiations. So as we go to Q&A, and we pull up the information here, and again, an appreciation for everyone's time. We're happy to schedule a lease consultation call where we'll go through the critical dates, risk analysis of the leases. We'll spend some time analyzing your lease for traps. And otherwise, we'll touch on your plan, strategy, as well as where you see yourself to transitioning, what your specific situation with rent or missed rents or otherwise, and we'll help to advise on some strategies that work. No cost or commitment necessary, but it's important that, again, as a support to the Henry Schein dental community and otherwise, to help ensure that, again, we're aware of what the challenges are within the lease, and that we're also aware of how to use this to our advantage to make sure, no different than renegotiating insurance and all the other things you're doing right now, why not equally ensure that you have a lease rate that's aligned as well. So here's all my specific contact information. This will go directly to my inbox, info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, as well as a toll-free number, and this will ring through to my operations specialist who will help to coordinate a call with either myself or one of the members of my team. I would suggest that if you are, again, if your lease is coming up in the next 6 to 12 months, or if you're in a month-to-month lease situation, please mark urgent, and we'll help to prioritize those, again, in those situations, or especially those in any default situation, or if there's been any other specific issues or missed payments, we definitely want to help to prioritize those accordingly. Perfect. Why don't we pause there? I think that's perfect for time, and we'll go to some Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. If you're able to see the Q&A, feel free to jump through some of the questions yourself.
Sure. So here's one. And again, we'll some put their names. I'll keep this all as anonymous, of course. One of the doctors noted here, I'm hopefully about to sell my practice and will lease the building, which I own, to a buying dentist. What advice do you have for me as a potential landlord? So great question. So you're a practicing dentist today, you're looking to sell, and you're looking to make sure that you're now becoming a full-time landlord. So the next question is, do you have, or what do you have as a lease today to separate your building corporation from your practice corporation? And next is to think about how you want to structure it. Does it want to be a triple net lease, meaning base rent plus, plus, plus? Or do you want to have that as a gross lease? What do you want the new tenant to do? Some other good questions are, specifically here to, to owning is, if the landlord wants to, if you want to make changes or have access to the space, how much access do you want? And if the new tenant wants to come in and paint the walls purple and, change the space around, are you going to be okay with that? So it's definitely worthwhile, a good conversation. And yeah, definitely I would click yes for a consult. A lot of other questions I'd have for you in terms of transition plans, how you want to structure this in terms of sort of income flow, and then also to make sure that it's a smooth sale. The earlier you have that lease in place prior to the sale makes it that much easier. If you've created a lease from scratch, just as the buyer is about to take over your practice, then that's going to be a big red flag for their lenders and their professional team, because you've just created something from scratch. Far easier to say, oh, look, Mr. Buyer, this is a lease I've had for years, and I'm just simply transferring it on to you. Okay, great question. Some other ones: can deferred rent payments due to forbearance be tracked onto the back end of the lease? The short answer is yes. It just depends on how you structure it, and that there should be a proper lease amending agreement. And yes, we've been successful in moving sort of April and May to the end of the term. So that's great. We plan to be here anyways over the long run. It basically frees up 2 months of cash flow. So yes, that is key. I would caveat that though, doctor, that again, if you haven't got any deferrals, or if your lease is coming up in the near future, you might be able to do a whole lot more in exchange of a new 5 or 10-year lease. Another question here: what if you ask the landlord to upgrade the HVAC, UVC, and fresh air intake, etc., and the landlord denies this? What recourse is there? So that's a little more challenging. It again, unfortunately, comes back to how your current lease is structured. So if you've asked the landlord specifically for some help on the HVAC, but it's your responsibility, the landlord could actually come back and say, by the way, do you have maintenance contracts? Per Article 76, you're also responsible for making sure it's maintained every few months. So again, if they deny it, it really comes down to more so not about denying, but of the cost. And if you are making changes, we do want to make sure that in the alteration section, it is clear as to whose responsibility it is. Another question here is, obviously the pandemic is impacting dental leases that were written prior to the pandemic. How does the CDC and federal restrictions like the shutdown have on the lease that was written without this material? So that's a good question. As mentioned a couple of times, unfortunately, it is linked to however the lease is structured. And most, of course, didn't have and wouldn't have pandemic language. So unfortunately, whatever was in the lease, if it didn't have anything about state of emergency or shutdowns or otherwise, unfortunately, there's not much to stand on, because it's just as simple as, I'm here, I have access to it, but through to outside entities outside of our control, we're not responsible. There can be some force majeure, meaning that some of the performance, they can't hold some of the performance against you, but it wouldn't impact rent. It is obviously the landlords did a great job, and their lawyers spend a lot of money to create a very landlord friendly lease. Here's another question: what to do if landlord wants to relocate you, even though you have 2 years plus option to extend remaining? The lease says that they can relocate, but they must offer a similar size space and maintain a monthly lease. But the build out would be excessive unless they cover that too. So yeah, doctor, that's a big one. Definitely we should have a follow-up conversation on that, because I do want to see exactly how they've structured that. The short answer is that it's a problem, because they can move you and you're stuck there for the next 2 years. If it's a similar size space but a different shape, my concern would be is that if it's a smaller shape, then or a wedge shape, for example, instead of rectangle, that means less less operatories and therefore less production. If it's a slightly wider space or otherwise, that could be increased rent to what we have. But the biggest issue is the patient attrition and the lights out component. So if the landlord today gives you 60 days notice and you're out, if your lease doesn't give you the ability to have the new practice built and up and running, so you close on a Friday and you open on a Monday, that's a problem, because it could be 1 or 2 or 3 months, as you know, that you're out of your space and you're now waiting for the new space to open. So as you can imagine, it's not even the loss of production, it's the patient attrition. That could be 10% per month of patients that go down the road and never come back. So if the landlord is talking relocation, I would strongly suggest to be smart, be proactive. First of all, have it reviewed and be conscious from that. In addition, through here, are there specific language in the current leases dealing with the COVID-19? I think we've covered that a few times. Are you seeing an increase or decrease in dentists buying their offices versus renting? Good question. What we're seeing now is, first of all, a very tough time to be a landlord right now. And landlords that, were mom and pop or professionals and decided that they wanted to get into the game and, start playing a little Monopoly, unfortunately now didn't budget for the fact of having 10 or 20 or 30% of their tenants not paying their rent or vacant properties. So many of them are heavily leveraged. And a lot of you saw it right from the landlords when you asked for a deferral arrangement. The landlord said, I can't afford it. I have to pay my mortgage payments and I have to collect rent. So the short answer is, for those that did buy recently, many of which unfortunately have regretted a little bit because now we've got the debt load of a full building plus the debt load of building at a practice. So we're now carrying two and we've lost the flexibility. Right? If COVID-19 impacts some of the local market or some of the local, patient rates or foot traffic, then we lose the ability to move the practice. So in my opinion right now, the smart and the groups and otherwise are focused on leasing because of that flexibility. And they don't want to tie up all that capital right now when doctors, look, cash is king. So to tie up, $500,000 or $300,000 on a building, plus a new build-out practice, and you're thinking of selling in the near future, just ask yourself, do you really want to take all that on in such an unpredictable environment? Another good question here. Now is an opportunity, do you recommend 2 5-year options or 3 4-year, 3-year options? So good question. Depends on your situation. When are you thinking of transitioning? Right? How long do you see yourself practicing for? What does your exit strategy look like? Is it a share sale, asset sale, etc.? Lots of good follow-up questions here. The short answer is that, look, you've got an established built-out dental practice, and that's valuable. Even if you, quote, sell your practice for $1 and transfer the lease, well, that new associate is taking over your practice is avoiding hundreds of thousands of dollars of build-out costs to come in with a turnkey practice. So, typically we do suggest either 5 or 10-year term with 2 5-year options, depending on the situation, but you want to make sure those options are transferable, meaning that if you're purchasing a doctor, if you've got 1 year left on your lease, but the options are only personal to you, which is very common in California and other major markets, and that's great for you, but when you sell, the new doctor now only has 1 year left on the lease, and that can be a major issue in securing financing. Another good question here about long-term leases. So no, anything longer than a 10-year lease is typically only good for the broker that's trying to gain commissions on that. So typically no, a 10-year term is typically pretty standard and gives you the most leverage. A little longer really doesn't give that much more in our experience. Realtors use standard contracts that have legal backing. Do dental business brokers use a standardized contract? So I don't know if we're talking about the sale of the practice. I'd have a few follow-up questions for you on that one. But the short answer is there is no such thing as a standard form lease. Big takeaway from today, there's no such thing as a standard form lease. Well, yes, right? Brokers love to say, hey, here's what it is and sign here and push hard. Our landlords are great to say, hey, I've got a lineup of other doctors that want to take over the space. The reality is that isn't always the case. And more importantly, every lease is a little unique. And we have thousands of leases in our database over the years, of course, and every one is unique. And every one, we found different elements to be able to negotiate or improve certain sections. Here's another doctor in New York, just negotiated a new 10-year lease with a 5-year option in New York City. Can I renegotiate for better price per month because they're empty spaces? I doubt it, and not very happy with the new lease. So The short answer is unfortunately, if you have just signed a new long-term lease, that is unfortunately not necessarily to your benefit. And typically, if you're in term, then no, there isn't much incentive for the landlord to make those changes. There has to be something in it for them. However, I would say if it's an expansion or looking to make a significant improvement or investment into the space, doctors, please don't go out and spend $20, $30, $40,000 or put in hardwood or put in new floorings without properly negotiating the lease. Because when you come up to your renewal in a couple of years, what's the landlord going to do? Oh, great. Geez, thanks for spending all that money a few years ago. I know you're not going anywhere, so here's your new lease rate. So think about it from the business perspective is a good one. So another good questions here. Are you able to give me some sense of market rental rates in the Windsor area for commercial property? So I just need to know the little more specifics from you. But doctor, please, when you exit, either email us a copy of your current lease at info@ and include your specific address you'd like the rental rate analysis on. And we'll certainly do it, and then click yes in the survey for question number 3 for it. And we're happy to provide that for you. Another good question here. If the landlord is already forgave half of April rent and gave some definitive option, should I still do the negotiations? So the short answer is yes. If the landlord just gave you half a month off and your lease is still coming due, it doesn't preclude you from getting future benefits. You know, candidly, only half of 1 month as of a forgiveness is nice, but I think we're missing some of the bigger picture. And if you still have a financial need and you're still closed and you're still needing help, then it's proper leverage to help ensure that we have a new lease aligned with your practice goals. Another question from an anonymous doctor is now a good time to sell a practice? That's the $1 million question. If you talk to any member of the practice transition team on Henry Schein and practice brokers out there, they'll tell you that business is booming and they've got more leads than they know what to do with. And doctors now are looking at this and saying, hey, I got to get out. My spouse tells me I got to get out. You know, I'm so close to these patients. I'm very concerned about contracting COVID, and there's a high degree of nervousness. So therefore, is it a good time to sell? I think that the first question is everything set up in preparation for sale? And one of the main questions is the lease. So some of the brokers have sent us leases lately as part of their due diligence, and many of which are, you know, have very poor leases that have either personal guarantees or continuing liability post-sale, or all the controls in the hands of the landlord. So this is just one aspect, is to, before you sell or go to sell, right, you're, in our experience, far better leverage with the landlord to say, hey, look, I want to renegotiate a new lease and I want to look at some long-term runway, to do that first, rather than bring a buyer and say, well, hey, I know my lease is coming due. Hey, Mr. Landlord, I'm out. Here's the new guy or gal taking over my practice, and good luck. So, you know, to be clear, best to structure a new long-term lease agreement or negotiate the renewal to ensure that it's prepared for sale first, prior to walking down the path and putting it up onto the market. Hopefully that's clear. Can we negotiate to have the rent reduced due to COVID? The short answer is yes. If there's ever been a good time to negotiate or renegotiate the rents based on current market uncertainty, now is it. And, you know, with all the, you know, the news reports and everything going on, it does give us good leverage that we can be aggressive with some landlords. And if we're, you know, paying more than we can afford, or we just don't see it financially viable and we might be forced to relocate, then yes, right, we need to take a little bit more of a bullish position to be renegotiating rents and preparing us for the next step. Another question here, what if you're a recent startup and having a problem paying the lease in New York? So yeah, I mean, certainly that is a challenging situation. The first answer is, you know, again, depending on the lease and depending on, If you bought the practice and if it's coming up for renewal, then that gives you leverage if there's any change. But if you're just recently you've secured a long-term lease, and there's some financial challenges, then the first section is to, first of all, read the lease so you're clear. And then number two is a good opportunity to have a conversation with the landlord to say, look, here's the situation. They don't want to lose you, right? With that being said, they also want to fill the practice, but having a candid conversation with the landlord could be a good strategy, again, especially if you're 1 or 2 years into a 10-year term, and perhaps they can work something out. However, please ensure that it's properly structured so that whatever they've agreed to, it is well documented, that they can't come back and, oh, that was in a text or email, oh, well, right? That can certainly be very, very positive, negative rather. Another question here, and I'll keep going, again, because these are some great conversations. I'm negotiating an offer on a purchase in hopes of leaving my rental. Would you recommend a delayed closing or a lease back if I still have 1.5 years on my current lease? So good question there. I think a few things. Number one is if you're contemplating buying a building now, I would be cautious, because if it gets worse before it gets better and there's a second wave or otherwise, the value of that building is going to be less, in my opinion. So if you're in your current location, I would much rather see you secure a short-term lease while the dust settles, rather than you having to spend $1 million to buy a building and then build out a new practice. Again, if there's, heaven forbid, a second wave or a second lockdown or otherwise, you've now got 2 major debt obligations, and that can be a very game-changing type of situation. So from that perspective, if you are, again, you've got about 1.5 years left, be strategic. And I'd run the numbers. Compare what a different landlord would be to move you in and give you a beautiful sweetheart deal close by to earn your business from a landlord that is desperate to secure a new tenant. You might see a significant variance between your total cost now as a landlord versus what your leasehold cost would be for a separate lease. But again, we're happy to help in both situations. Let that be in understanding the lease for a practice you own, or to be renegotiating one as well. Okay, great. I'll pause there. Was Mr. Sweet, was there anything else I missed in terms of some additional questions here?
No, I think you knocked them all out.
Perfect. Great. Well, again, on your screen, everyone, feel free to either click yes on the survey afterwards, or quickly email us at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. I'll stay to my chair side here for anything that's urgent. Feel free to give us a quick call back at the toll-free number, and we'll coordinate that accordingly. And again, doctors, look, you're not alone in all of this. These are very unusual and unsettling times. And just know that it's, let it be through Henry Schein Practice Services or otherwise, just use this as a good opportunity to get a good understanding for the proper obligations, including the lease, have it reviewed, and let's look at it as a glass half full. This could be finally the nudge in the right direction to either do a little expansion down the road, to renew, reset, or to potentially buy and add a location to the portfolio. So perfect. Unless there were any additional questions, I certainly appreciate everyone's time, and looking forward to chatting with most of you. Have a great night.
Super. Thanks, Eric, and thank you, everyone, for the very extensive Q&A. We certainly appreciate your time and participation. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to email Eric directly. As a thank you for attending, we will be sending out a link of today's recording in the coming week via email. On behalf of Henry Schein, thanks again to Eric, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, guys. Stay safe and stay healthy. All the best.